Well, the big thing there for me is that everybody talked about it. Talks about residential school in those kinds of terms. That you have to ask yourself what they were being taught. I mean, what grated on me, a whole bunch of things grated on me during the apology. But to call the residential schools an educational institution is an outright lie. They weren't getting any education there. To learn how to read and write sufficiently to be, a farmhand or to be a cook is not what you call. We're bringing Indians into. We're inviting Indians into the Canadian polity. That's not true at all. The place that was being made for First Nations people, mopping floors, digging ditches, flipping hamburgers. So what we were being invited into in the residential school, what was being prepared for us, was our place as menials. We were to be the peons. That doesn't mean that there weren't going to be non-Indian peons. When you have a class society where some people are living on the backs of others, you need a whole bunch of peons because, it's pyramidal in shape. There are fewer people at the top than there are at the bottom. But the people at the bottom, nobody really cares what color they are or where they come from. And so what the Indians were learning their place in the residential schools. And that's not an education, that's an ideology. When you're taught that what you can aspire to, after 10 years at McDonald's, hey, I'm going to be the chief hamburger flipper, I'm going to only $0.50 under minimum wage. Those are the aspirations that are being taught, you're not being conditioned to become a member of Canadian society. You're being conditioned to be a piece of wood, some kind of apparatus that's useful to somebody. Well, their Indians would be considered admissible to the extent that they were useful along the margins of Canadian society. Let's face it, a lot of people don't. You'll say the judges of Canada, the members of Parliament, the bureaucrats of Canada don't have their aspirations that their children will become ditch diggers, right? But there are needed. Ditch diggers are needed. People are needed to pick up trash and sweep the streets and so on and so on. So we got to have a few of those. And the residential schools, first of all, they weren't too concerned with the quality of life in them. If Indians died in residential school, well, okay, fine. If some of them make them through, fine. But what the residential school was not graduating were people who were going to compete with the upper classes in terms of highly paid jobs or authoritative positions. I mean, one of the things that you don't want are Indians who can read the treaties, or Indians who will read the memoirs of the non-Indians who signed the treaties, who did the sharp dealing. They're not going to want Indians who can read what it says in international law. I mean, just take for a moment. Why did Canada allow to put in that subsection E under Article 2, taking or forcibly removing children from the group and putting them under control of another group? They could only do that under the notion that Indians were never going to learn how to read. And consequently, since none of them were going to complain that they had taken and were taking Indians from their families and putting them under control of other people, and that Indians would never learn how to read properly or understand international law, or if they did learn, they'd learn how to read, the Bible and hymn books and so on, and the instructions on a spatula or a shovel. That's all they needed to learn how to read. But Indians would never be smart enough, have enough acumen to actually understand what was going on. I mean, in a lot of ways, that's behind the apology, the non-apology that took place on June 11th, is that Harper could only do that under the notion that the smartest Indians in the world are the morons that he invited down to listen and to accept his, quote, apology, unquote. Now, maybe the people that he invited did demonstrate that they didn't have that acumen, but it must be a great fear of Canadians in general, that Indians are actually going to learn enough to compete intellectually with First Nations people. If you again go back to Raphael Lemkin, his writing on colonialism said that colonial policy has to keep Native populations in a state of perpetual ignorance. They have to institutionalize that. Again, because it helps them maintain their hegemony over these populations. It allows the colonizing nation to prepare a place that it's willing to let First Nations people occupy, and no more. To go no further than that. That means, I don't know, low-paying jobs. That means a lot of drunkenness, a lot of family breakdown. It certainly means the destruction of the forms of life that First Nations people were engaged in before that. Really, there's a very large kind of anti-intellectualism built into First Nations forms of life now. It's not that Indians can't be intellectuals or can't be smarter, but they learn the same racist lessons that the residential schools had. One of the reasons that you could close the residential schools was that you now had a public education system that worked just as effectively as the residential school system did in terms of creating the kind of alienated First Nations youth as the residential schools was creating. There's a sort of a turnoff associated with Indian issues, that somehow Indians are, an archaic issue, and that Indians have to come into the 20th century or the 21st century, whichever century. I think it would be quite possible to create the kind of mindset in everybody, not just in First Nations people, but in Canadians in general also, the kind of mindset that would be necessary to undo this particular damage and build a better world. That's why it's so important that the forces behind the operation of the residential school, that they be in control of the educational system, of the public relations system, and so on. I don't know how many times I've seen over and over newspaper headlines, people talking about this is the great apology is now ended, this chapter, this bad chapter of Canadian history. Everybody wants to turn the page and run ahead so quickly, and there's a reason. Because if you sit and you examine, you begin to realize, well, wait a second. They have very carefully avoided dealing with the issue. This is a public relations exercise. This is not an exercise in undoing harm. This is an exercise in furthering the harm. That takes an analytic mind, and it takes discipline, and it takes knowledge of lots of little pieces of things, and to see an overall picture, and that's all destroyed. They see the struggle as becoming more like Canadians, so they've adopted this assimilationist, which I would call genocidal, agenda as their own. And that's a real danger, because one of the great things about being a First Nations person is that you do, if you do it properly, you do question everything. You do have justification for being suspicious about everything, because when you begin looking at the history of it, you say, that didn't help, that wasn't any good, that was a huge, horrible thing, and so on and so on and so on, rather than, oh, what a good idea, oh, what a wonderful thing. When you begin criticizing properly, you get some idea of what you could have done instead and what could be done instead. And that's falling by the wayside. We're under that kind of a model. I think the entire world rides off the cliff, rather than, you don't sink one half of a boat. The entire boat goes down eventually. The best resistance, I would say, would be cultivation of friends and understanding what it is that you're fighting about. Like I say, a lot of people are fighting the wrong battle. If you ask them, what are you doing this for, and so on, you get reasons, but it turns out not to be the real reasons. And in First Nations country, we don't, this is a large generalization, and it's not 100% true. But in general, First Nations people don't understand what's necessary to defend their ways of life because we never had to articulate our ways of life, because we never had to defend them before. Like I say, before 1492, we weren't capitalists. Part of what that meant was is that we weren't forcing ourselves on one another. The Crees and, let's say, the Blackfoot may not have gotten along very well, but the struggle between the Crees and the Blackfoot before 1492 wasn't that the Crees were trying to turn Blackfoot into Crees, or that the Blackfoot were trying to turn Crees into Blackfoot. People just more or less lived and let live. And under those circumstances, you don't sit down and answer the question, gee, what does it mean to be a Blackfoot, or what does it mean to be a Cree? You don't have to, since it's not under attack, right? But what capitalism does is it attacks that precisely. That's precisely where the attack is. So when you say to a First Nations person, well, what does it mean to be a First Nations person? They can't tell you. They think, because they're, again, listening to propaganda, that it's got something to do with race. But see, all you have to do is be born with a particular genetic material, and you're just naturally that way. But racism is, again, a derivative of the material form that capitalism requires, that you begin to believe that it's somehow built within the purity of essence of the particular types of person, and that you don't have to do anything to defend it. But the proper way of understanding this entire issue is in terms of praxis. And that is, no, it's not a question of what your genes are, but it's a question of what you do, how you live in this world. And the way the Crees lived in this world was different from the way the Blackfoot lived in this world, was different from the way the Oneidas lived in this world, was different from the way Maliseets lived in this world, and so on and so on and so on. And it's a matter of being able to carry out that praxis. And by that I don't mean, shooting bows and arrows and wearing buckskin and stuff like that. The form of life that you adopt can take all kinds of different material forms, but the ideological aspects of it conditions how you decide society is to operate.
The new settlers abused the natives' hospitality, they defaced their graves, they massacred their tribes, and they exulted that, here's the quote, that God was pleased to smite his heathen enemies and give us their lands for inheritance. And it's remarkable, that God, let me give you that quote again. God was pleased to smite his heathen enemies and give us their lands for inheritance. It's really remarkable how pleasing God always seems to engage murder and real estate acquisition. It's just wonderful how that, all through history you see that. We're just doing God's work here, And sure enough, as the victims of imperialism were exterminated, so were they demonized and dehumanized. Why was it? Did they bring them in to just add some warmth and color to their Calvinist lives? Black people were brought to this country, African were brought to this country for one reason, and one reason alone, and that was to gain access to a profitable workforce and to live splendidly off the super exploitation of African labor. The white colonizers abducted black people to toil on land that they stole from red and brown people. But in short order, in time, they had to rationalize their atrocities in racist terms. You see, when they come in and they steal your land, they burn your crops, they slaughter your herds, they devastate your villages, they destroy your townships, they incinerate your fields, they enslave your inhabitants to go work in the mines, they rape your women, they spit your children on bayonets. The colonizers, after a while, they have to deny not their own humanity, which they should, but they deny the humanity of their victims. They see them as moral inferiors, not fully human. And that is the essence of racism, to demonize your victim.